Jacob, welcome to the PoliticsJOE podcast. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me. I'm Jacob. I'm the editor of a new online magazine called Dispatch, which is committed to on the ground, deeply reported features. Our sort of focus is on quirky, forgotten, neglected communities, the sort of stuff you wouldn't read in your mainstream legacy media. Like in recent weeks, we've had everything from a report on South London's pigeon racing scene. We sent someone to go to a David Icke convention. Also serious reporting as well, if that is serious. Sort of stuff like going to a Texan town that Elon Musk is buying up and talking to the residents there, as well as some, investigations like this opioids one, which you're
Yeah,
talking about.
I mean, the writing in Dispatch and the stories you cover is just so interesting, and I think will be of a lot of interest to our audience. There's that sort of like weird Britain, like Britain underbelly, hidden Britain that you don't always see, and you definitely don't see covered like in your, day-to-day media consumption. But as you said, we're here to chat about a piece you wrote called Britain's Hidden Opioid Crisis, which I guess I kind of made a video based on the figures that you uncovered during your investigation, which will be out tomorrow on our YouTube channel. Um, but can you tell us, what is the hidden opioid crisis? When did you first become aware of this?
I suppose so. I sort of got interested in Britain's opioid crisis via America, because we don't really talk about having opioids in Britain. But I was in America just before the election last year in Pennsylvania, in a little town called Bethlehem, writing a piece, which is in a big swing county in a very important swing state. And I was writing a piece and speaking to a lot of people living there, and everyone had a story about fentanyl and about synthetic opioids. And you walk around the streets, and in public spaces they have this anti-opioid drug called Narcan or naloxone, which is used to reverse opioid overdoses. And it was so present there, and it felt so foreign as a sort of British, journalist out there to see this, that I thought I'd do a little bit of research into, what's happening over here in the UK. And was surprised that there really hadn't been much written. I mean, that's partly because fentanyl hasn't really come over to the UK in the same way. But also, there's very little recorded data publicly that the government makes aware. So in America, there's a big public dashboard which you can go on, you can Google it and it'll come up, and you can sort of see how many synthetic opioid overdoses there have been, but we didn't have that here. And it's sort of in that research that I came across this fantastic GP in Birmingham called Dr. Judith Yates, who I know you've spoken to as well, who has sort of been quite frustrated about the lack of understanding around synthetic opioids. And so she's based in Birmingham, and she started going, in 2009 when she was a GP, just to coroner's offices and looking through the reports and making her own sort of database of opioid overdoses and drug overdoses in the area. And in sort of 2019, 2020, she started noticing that there was this new thing called a nitazene, which is a sort of a new type of synthetic opioid. And there are a few very small localized news reports around that. The Big Issue did a fantastic piece on it as well. But that was sort of it. There's this thing called a nitazene, which is, we're going to talk about later, which is it's a synthetic opioid that makes fentanyl look like Calpol. So it's up to 40 times stronger than fentanyl. But we know very little about it. And I was quite frustrated by that. So I went on to the Department of Health page, and they'd given out some data saying that, since January 2023, there's been an estimated 400 nitazene-related deaths. And then another document, they broke it down by northeast, northwest, southeast. But they hadn't really gone any more granular than that, which is very frustrating. And so that sort of got me onto it in the start. And I sent off some FOIs, and it sort of rolled from there.
Because I think, like you said, we have this image in Britain of synthetic opioids as the fentanyl crisis. It's very much in the US, and everyone that I've mentioned Nitazenes to, no one has heard of them. And there is this really interesting story of the sort of political and economic forces that happened in the world that had this sort of butterfly effect that led to Nitazenes ending up in the UK. And this is something that Dr. Judith Yates spoke to both of us about, and it is really fascinating because it sort of begins with the US administration cracking down on fentanyl being shipped into the US, and because it's being made in these underground laboratories in China. And when they realized, well, we can't really manufacture fentanyl anymore, they kind of went back into the archives. I think Judith Yates was saying that in the 1950s in Switzerland, there were chemists that were looking for an alternative painkiller to morphine, and they developed at the same time as fentanyl this class of drugs called nitazenes, but they were never, unlike fentanyl, they were never licensed for medical use because they were so deadly and so potent, and basically they lead your lungs to shut down quite quickly. And so when these chemists went back to the archives and found nitazenes, they started manufacturing them. And then in 2021, as you'll know, the Taliban came back into power in Afghanistan, and they banned the cultivation of opium, which led some heroin dealers in Britain to panic about the supply and look for alternatives that they could cut their heroin with, which I think is just such an interesting sort of domino effect of political and economic decision.
It really is. I mean, it's fascinating on like a geopolitical level to think that, you know, the first wave, because sort of, as you say, arrived in two waves, started with Donald Trump trying to ban fentanyl and stop it coming into the US, which, you know, whatever you think about Trump, isn't, you know, a bad thing that he was doing. He said to China, stop making fentanyl. And then again, the Taliban clamping down on heroin a couple of years later. But I think what's really interesting as well, and slightly tragic, is looking at the sort of the different victims that those two waves affected. So the first wave, say, is these Chinese secret underground laboratories who found this drug that was extremely deadly. I mean, as a way of sort of like envisioning how deadly it is, you know, a heroin overdose can take about 20 minutes. Nitazene takes 2. But you know, that first wave, they were putting it into oxycodone or benzodiazepines, which are sort of used as an anti-anxiety drug for a lot of people. Sometimes it's an anti-pain drug as well. This is sort of on the back of lockdown, which we've sort of forgotten how traumatic that was and the effects it had on people's mental health, especially when, you know, young people have been locked away, spending their late teens in there. So in that first wave, it was a lot of young men predominantly who were 20, 21, who were ordering anti-anxiety medication, or what they thought was anti-anxiety medication, off the dark web, and then overdosing in their bedrooms. So that was the first wave. And the second wave, as you said, you know, so this was a couple years later in 2023, and it was in heroin, and predominantly, affected homeless people and those living in HMOs, in slightly more deprived areas, who thought they were taking heroin, but it was laced with nitazenes or just nitazenes, and they died.
I think that is one of the interesting aspects of the story, is that most of the victims were totally unaware of, again, like we were, like they were unaware of what nitazenes were. They had no idea that it was something that was being cut into their drugs. They thought they knew what they were taking. And like you said, the second wave really affected people that were living in on the streets or in sort of supported accommodation HMOs, which I think, if you're not aware what a HMO is, it's a house where people who aren't related to each other live together. And also in these supported housing HMOs, there's meant to be some level of residential care and oversight and services provided as well. But I think there's questions over how much of that actually takes place. And I actually spoke to a young man called Ryan. He was 27, and last year he was living in a HMO and he was a heroin user, and he took, unknowingly to him, heroin that had been laced with nitazenes, and he described it as having knocked him completely off of his feet. And he said that was really surprising to him because he had such a high tolerance, and he was like, you know, for someone like me to be knocked off my feet, you know, I can't even imagine what it would be like for someone who didn't have as high a tolerance. And he said the first thought that ran through his head was that fentanyl? And it wasn't until he had gone to a sort of drug services centre and he saw posters that had been put up by the council that were warning people about what nitazenes were. And I asked him, because one of the things that kind of came up again and again when we were looking into the story was questions around, well, how do we prevent more deaths? One of them, obviously, like you mentioned, was carrying naloxone, and this kind of like miracle cure to stop people overdosing on opioids. But the other thing that was coming up was testing. Maybe if people knew what was in their drugs, they would think twice before taking them. And I kind of posed that question to Ryan, and I said, if you could test your drugs, would that have made a difference? And he said no, because if the choice was between not taking heroin or taking heroin laced with nitazenes, because he said, because I am an addict, I would have still taken the heroin. Which I think is interesting and raises bigger questions, I guess, around funding for adult social services, because one of the things that your piece brings up, and I wonder if you could talk about it a little bit, is kind of the situation that Birmingham Council was in at the time, which maybe explains why Birmingham has been the epicenter of these overdoses.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, so Birmingham did these FOIs, which were sent to Department of Health to try and find out where a lot of these overdoses were taking place and these deaths. I think that touching on this point of like, why is this happening? Before we get to necessarily Birmingham and those sort of testing things, I think one of the main reasons we don't really know about it, there's been very little warning or public awareness about it. So I have, in response to this data, I FOI'd the Department of Health and said, can you give us more detail on where people are dying? And was told, no, we can't tell you because it's a national security issue, because it involves the National Crime Agency. Which is slightly peculiar and very frustrating, because it means that to date we still don't know, the towns or cities where people are dying from nicotine overdoses. So to get around that, sent off FOIs to every ambulance service in the UK to find out where in the past year, in 2024 and 2023, they'd used naloxone, this anti-opioid drug, this opioid reversing drug, and that revealed that sort of these overdoses are taking place across the UK, from Cornwall up to Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, Southeast. They're everywhere. But Birmingham was the worst hit. I think in 2024, there were 720 overdoses treated by Narcan, which is a massive also a massive undercount that only takes in the ambulance services. So as to why Birmingham is, that ground zero for all this, I'm not sure if you found this, but it's quite tricky to find out in Birmingham what's going on from the authorities there. So, when obviously you go straight to the council and ask, and they're very reluctant to talk, as are charities. I think, I think you experienced the same when you were doing your report. Part of that is because, I think, as you were hinting at earlier, is that at the time in 2023, when all this was going on, Birmingham was going through a real crisis. The Birmingham Council was going through a real crisis, where just a few months after the first Nitazenes hit, the council declared bankruptcy, which meant that, arguably we can ask, was it in a strong position to deal with arguably one of the most deadly synthetic opioid crises in Britain in the past decade? The answer is likely no. But then there are other sort of things going on as well. So just as it hit, a new head of the West Midlands Police comes in, and just as people are starting to die from nicotine overdoses, he orders all officers to stop carrying naloxone, this anti-synthetic opioid drug, so he can hold a review. They later told me that a lot of this was because a lot of it was out of date. So again, that's a really bad situation to be in if you're faced with this overdose crisis. So it's almost like a perfect storm. And then sort of behind all this as well, you can, as you were hinting at, you can look at sort of how funding cuts have really affected, drug treatment more broadly across the UK. I know that experts in the field, both in universities and on the front line, are very frustrated they're not getting enough money and haven't been having it for about 12 years or so, which means that we can't fund proper drug testing centres or drug testing rooms, which means we're one of the few countries in Europe that don't have it properly. We can't fund proper public awareness. which means that we don't necessarily know that these nitazenes are, prevalent or where they're prevalent, which means that we can't treat them properly and warn vulnerable people that they might be taking place. And you can sort of look at what's happening in other countries just to show how bad this is. So there are a few places where between 2023 and 2024, where nitazene overdoses have gone down. Two of them are in Scotland, in Glasgow and Edinburgh, where they do actually have relatively advanced drug treatment centres and opened up some there. In Ireland, there was a nitazene sort of wave last year that was dealt with very differently from in Birmingham, where the authorities completely sort of stepped in straight away. They put up billboards by the side of roads saying, watch out. They did active outreach to homeless people. That just didn't really happen in Birmingham.
I think you mentioned Glasgow there, and they have the Hunter Street Consumption Room, which is the first in the UK of its kind. And I know that Dr. Judith Yates has asked for Birmingham to have a similar service, but the Home Office is saying they can't have it. And interestingly, the way the Hunter Street Consumption Room operates, if I'm understanding this right, it's like grey area where basically the police just won't act on it. So it's been effectively decriminalized, even though maybe it's operating in this grey area. I think one of the things that's interesting about this and around awareness and is to do with the sort of communities that have been the worst affected by the second wave of nitazenes entering the UK, and the fact that it is the homeless community, people that are living in really unstable housing. And one of the things that I noticed on quite a visual level about Birmingham was that when you go in the area around the station, it's and in the centre of Birmingham, it's really beautiful. There was a lot of money during the Commonwealth Games that was kind of put into regenerating the city. But I think there is an interesting question around well, who did they regenerate it for and who benefited from that? Because the areas of land that have been regenerated around the Bull Ring, they are like Canary Wharf, where they have their own private security who, because it is private land, they're allowed to move people on from it. And that creates quite an interesting scenario where they actually have bollards that mark out where this land starts and ends. And when you walk out of it, this area that's full of tourists and new restaurants, and it's buzzing and it's super clean, and then you walk just one street down, like myself and my videographer did, and we found this street that's empty shops, abandoned shops that clearly people are living in. And we just were like, why don't we kind of go in and have a look around? They were empty at this time, and we just went through kind of down a side street to the back of one of these buildings, which was a car park, and there we found mattresses that clearly people were sleeping on. There was lots of drugs paraphernalia, clearly people were living here, and it felt like a real division within Birmingham. And it was a real well, they've regenerated the city, but for whom? And also who gets to be part of Birmingham city centre as well? I thought it raised a lot of questions around that, because clearly it isn't for these people that are really suffering. They've just been pushed further and further and further out. And I just thought it was quite interesting just how visual and how obvious that was in the redevelopment of Birmingham. That was a slight tangent.
No, I think that's it's such a good point, because sort of look at who's overdosing here. It's not rich people in affluent areas. It's people living in deprived areas, and that's partly because people in deprived areas are more likely to be using drugs like heroin, or what they think is heroin is actually a nitazene. But also, since the Taliban cut a lot of their heroin supply, pretty much all of it, heroin's become really expensive in the UK, which means that some rich users still might be able to afford it, but the people on the streets or in HMOs are not going to be able to. So I would say it's also a class issue.
Definitely. Actually something, and I wonder if I could get you to speak about who Jackie is, but one of the things that she said to me is that she, when she was speaking to people that used heroin in the aftermath of her son's death, she said exactly what you said there, that the pure heroin is kept for the richer users and that everyone else is getting cut heroin. But yeah, I would invite you to chat about Jackie.
So Jackie Mackeno, she lives in southwest Birmingham. She is the mother of a young man called Simeon who overdosed and died from Nitazenes, who is extremely angry and is essentially launching a one-woman crusade to raise awareness about the families left behind from nicotine overdoses, but also raise awareness about the drug more broadly. She, her son had troubles with substance abuse growing up. He was in and out of prison. But, and eventually started taking heroin and overdosed as a result. And was living in an HMO in North Birmingham in the sort of the Lozells district. After he died, she sort of was left with no explanation for what caused it. The authorities didn't know what was going on. The hospital as well was equally clueless. So it's really struck talking to her, asking, what is she doing at the moment? We have a sort of middle-aged woman going up to the HMO where her son died and knocking on the doors and asking what was going on and basically trying to find out about Nitazenes herself. Fortunately, on hand is this, I suppose the hero of this story, if there is one, Dr. Judith Yates, who lives in Birmingham as well, who eventually met Jackie and is helping her, I think, at the moment with trying to find out exactly what's going on and sort of in terms of coroner's reports and stuff. But it's a real case of, governmental and civil neglect that a mother could lose her son in that fashion, and be left with no answers as to what caused it and how other young men are going to stop dying.
Definitely. I think one of the things that's quite interesting is where this story is going next and where Nitazenes are going next. Because in London last week, or earlier this month, there were 2 people that took what was sold as ecstasy, and testing indicated that these pills actually contained Nitazenes, and they died taking it. And London clubs like the Cause and a few others have put out warnings to their patrons about these specific pills, warning people what's in them. I think it will be interesting to see where awareness goes next with Nitazenes, if it is starting to enter the drug supply, the party drug supply of people that aren't taking harder drugs like heroin. And I wonder if it will raise more awareness, but also, tragically, I wonder if it will just lead to a spike in overdoses because people, like I mentioned, who take these drugs don't have the tolerance of someone that takes heroin.
I think that that case that you speak of, so I think it's the first case of sort of young clubbers in London. I think it's possibly still unclear whether it was caused by ecstasy or caused by some sleeping pills that they were trying to take. But it's increased. I don't think anyone is under any illusion that there will not be a Nitazene overdose spike, or at least increase in the coming years. These drugs are everywhere. We're seeing them as far away in Australia. We're seeing them in Mexico. We're seeing them in mainland Europe. They're going to start spreading. I think as to what happens when more people do overdose is that sort of rather tragically, if there are more cases in London, perhaps the subject will be pushed to the forefront of the media's mind, which is increasingly focused on London and what's going on there rather than England's peripheries. And that's really bad. It's a tragedy that what's gone on in Birmingham hasn't really been reported on before, that this is the epicenter of a Nitazene wave, but haven't really known about it till now. Perhaps if there's if we're going to be slightly optimistic, it might cause the government to wake up. What isn't going to help is the reticence of politicians and the health establishment when it comes to publishing data around Nitazenes. If we don't know where these drugs are and where they're killing people, we've got no real hope in sort of saving lives. So hopefully that gets better, but I'm, won't be holding my breath.
I wonder if there's anything that you are working on at Dispatch just now that you would like to tell our audience about or direct them towards any other investigations.
Yeah, I mean, without plugging it too hard, if you're watching this on your laptop, which you probably are, head over to dispatch-media.com and you'll see a real array of pieces that all of them have that focus of sort of getting out behind from desks and writing behind screens and getting out and talking to people and writing stories like this. I mean, this is a really serious story that is not being covered properly anywhere else. So you're going to find serious investigations like that. You're also going to find slightly lighter pieces, things on, the strange group that meets above pubs across the UK, which is plotting how to stop paying tax to the British state and believes that the laws of the government are some feudal imposition. You might read something in the coming weeks from Benidorm. I'm not going to say what's going on there, but that will be very exciting and very fun. We've got next week a fantastic piece of war reportage from Ukraine, which will shed light on the war in a way that you've never seen it.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And also head over tomorrow to the PoliticsJOE YouTube channel where you can watch the video I've made following up on Jacob's amazing original article, which was called Britain's Hidden Opioid Crisis. Thank you so much for joining us, Jacob.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.